At 17 minutes past 6 on September 7th, 1940, the air raid sirens wail across London's East End, and within the hour, 300 bombers will turn the Thames into a corridor of fire visible from 40 miles out. But 60 feet beneath the lawns of Bentley Priory, in a dim filter room thick with cigarette smoke and hushed tension, Section Officer Vera Stroud watches something stranger than flame. A faint green crawl on a cathode ray tube, the ghostly signature of a Heinkel formation still 90 miles out over the channel. She calls the bearing to the plotters below. Wooden counters slide across the map table. 4 minutes later, a hurricane section climbs hard from Hornchurch, vectored onto an intercept they cannot yet see. On paper, this is doctrine working. In practice, one of the controllers mutters into his tea, "Half the time, this radar's useless." He is not entirely wrong. Chain home, the lattice of steel towers strung along Britain's coast, offers ranges so vague that pilots joke about being sent to empty sky. Bearings drift, returns fade in ground clutter, height estimates can be wrong by thousands of feet. The system demands interpreters who guess as much as they calculate, a blend of trigonometry and intuition that no manual codifies. Yet tonight, as the docks ignite and the blitz begins in earnest, those blurry blips will guide 73 interceptions. Chaos, it turns out, has a pulse if you know how to read it. This is the story of how Robert Watson Watt's useless contraption became the nervous system that kept London breathing. Not a tale of immaculate foresight or technological supremacy, but of improvisation under scarcity, doctrine bent by necessity, and a system held together by tired women translating static into certainty. The myth says radar won the Battle of Britain. The reality is narrower and more human. A handful of operators learned to see in a new language just fast enough to matter. But survival had a cost measured in budget lines and bureaucratic knife fights. Even as Chain Home proved itself over the Channel, the Treasury and the Air Ministry clashed over every new tower, every training school, every mile of cable. Churchill, for all his soaring rhetoric about the few, signed memos in early 1941 that flatly opposed expanding radar coverage to the north and west. Resources, he argued, belonged with bombers, not what he termed defensive luxuries. Cabinet minutes from March of that year record his impatience with further expenditure on an unproven margin of advantage. The system that saved London in September nearly starved the following spring, a victim of the same scarcity that forced it to innovate in the first place. We are going to pull that contradiction apart memo by memo, tower by tower. You will see the original Treasury objections, the handwritten notes in the margins of Air Ministry briefs, the quietly insubordinate choices of engineers and station commanders who built what they were not quite authorized to build. We will walk through the technical limitations that made early radar as much liability as asset, and meet the people, WAAF plotters, filter room officers, maintenance crews working in North Sea gales, who turned limitation into improvised doctrine. Most of all, we will test the claim that stands at the heart of British memory, that technology and courage, in equal measure, held the line. The truth, as always, is more complicated, and it starts not with a breakthrough, but with a desperate guess on a Scottish cliff in February 1935. The guess begins on 12 February 1935, not on a Scottish cliff, but in a cramped office at the Radio Research Station in Slough, where a civil servant named A.P. Rowe has just asked Robert Watson Watt an impossible question. Can radio waves kill a pilot at 8,000 feet? Watson Watt, 43, rumpled and pragmatic, runs the numbers with his assistant, Arnold Wilkins. The answer comes back in an afternoon. No. To boil blood at range would require millions of watts in a transmitter the size of a cathedral. But the margins of Wilkins' calculation hold something else, a parenthetical note that a passing aircraft might reflect enough energy to be detected, perhaps tracked. Watson Watt writes it up not as a weapon, but as a warning system, 2 pages titled Detection and Location of Aircraft by Radio Methods. The Air Ministry, desperate for any edge against bombers that can already outrun biplane interceptors, gives him a month to prove it. On 26 February, in a frozen field near Daventry, a Handley Page Hayford lumbers back and forth through the beam of the BBC's shortwave transmitter. Watson Watt and three observers watch a cathode ray oscilloscope. When the bomber crosses the beam, the trace jumps, a spike of reflected energy, faint but measurable, flickering in and out as the aircraft turns. It is barely 10 miles range, less than 8 minutes of warning at cruise speed, and the bearing is little better than a guess, but it is real. Watson Watt does not promise miracles. He promises steel and masts and the ruthless simplification of physics into something a technician can fix with a spanner and a gale. Within 5 months, construction begins at Bawdsey Manor on the Suffolk coast. 4 timber towers, each 350 feet tall, strung with wire like skeletal harps. By 1937, Chain Home's first 5 stations blinked to life along the Thames approach, crude and unmistakable. The towers sway in wind, transmitters overheat, returns smear across the scopes in green ghosts that operators learn to read like tea leaves. Altitude accuracy is a polite fiction. A raid reported at 15,000 feet might be at 9 or 22. Low-level attackers, anything below 500 feet, vanish entirely beneath the coastal clutter, invisible until they are overhead. Weather plays havoc with propagation. Fatigue plays havoc with the filter room crews who stare at the scopes in 4-hour shifts that leave them hollow-eyed and guessing. The Tizard Committee, convened to evaluate air defense, does not flinch from the math. Britain has perhaps 600 modern fighters when war begins, will have fewer than 700 pilots trained to fly them, and must defend an island with 3,000 miles of coastline under skies a bomber can cross in 90 minutes. Radar does not multiply aircraft. It multiplies time, 15 minutes of warning, sometimes 20 if the raid forms up far enough out. Enough to climb, to position, to meet the enemy before he is over the city. Henry Tizard, dry and unfooled, calls it the critical margin. But technology alone is useless without a brain to interpret it. That brain belongs to Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, a man so dour his pilots call him Stuffy, who sees in Watson Watt's blips the skeleton of something doctrine has never imagined. A centralized system where radar, telephones, and filter rooms feed sector controllers who vector fighters like chess pieces onto an invisible board. He builds it piece by piece. Ops rooms deep underground, WAAF plotters trained to translate bearings into raids, sector stations linked by hardline trunk cables that cannot be jammed. It is heresy to Fighter Command's old guard, who believe in standing patrols and pilot initiative, not ground control. He ignores them. By 1940, he has wired southern England into a single reactive organism, slow and fallible, but capable of learning. Not everyone believes. Frederick Lindemann, Churchill's scientific confidant, wages a quiet campaign against Tizard and the radar advocates, pushing infrared detection and aerial mines, dismissing Chain Home as overcomplicated and underproven. The rivalry is polite, vicious, and bureaucratic. Committee votes, withheld funds, memos that never quite say sabotage but starve programs all the same. Tizard wins narrowly and only because war arrives before the argument ends. The photographs that survive from Bawdsey show lattice towers against low gray sky, technicians in coveralls splicing coaxial cable in the mud, WAAF operators bent over plotting tables in converted manor house ballrooms. There is not a Spitfire in sight. The image the public loves, the young pilot, the silk scarf, the triumph of courage and aluminum, rests on an invisible foundation of line-of-sight calculations, transformer huts, maintenance logs, and women's hands moving counters across maps in unheated rooms. Glamour flies at 20,000 feet. The grind happens at sea level, in the cable ducts and the filter rooms, and the 1,000 iterative fixes that turn theory into something a 19-year-old plotter can use to save London on a September night when the sky is full of fire. By the summer of 1940, Chain Home is operational from Portsmouth to Scapa Flow, 21 stations, a grid of eyes that cannot see everything but can see enough. The system is ready. Whether it is sufficient is a question that will be answered in minutes and lives, starting the moment the Luftwaffe crosses the coast in force. On 3 June 1940, the day after the last destroyer clears Dunkirk, The War Cabinet convenes to divide what remains: steel allocation, labor pools, cement for airfields, concrete for pillboxes. Everything is a zero-sum trade. The minutes, preserved in the Prem files, record Churchill's impatience in curt marginalia beside a Treasury brief on radar expansion. Can we afford luxuries? The brief in question requests materials and personnel for 10 additional chain-home low stations to cover the coastal blind spots where low-level raiders slip beneath the main tower's gaze, plus extensions to Scotland and Wales. The cost is modest in pounds, crushing in priority. France has fallen. Invasion barges are massing in Calais. The choice before the cabinet is brutal. Invest in early warning for battles that may never happen inland, or pour everything into guns, ships, and beach obstacles for the landing everyone expects within weeks. Frederick Lindman, Churchill's ever-present advisor, frames it plainly in a memo dated 8 June. Radar remains unproven in sustained operations and dependent on assumptions of enemy approach patterns we cannot guarantee. He does not recommend scrapping Chain-Home outright. By now it is too embedded, too visible. But he does argue for freezing expansion, diverting the steel and engineers to anti-aircraft batteries and the infrared technologies he has championed for years. The Chief of the Air Staff, Cyril Newell, counters with a one-page response that is all cold arithmetic. Without radar extension, Fighter Command will have no warning over the North Sea approaches, no coverage west of Portland, no ability to husband the 600 Hurricanes and Spitfires that represent the entire liquid reserve of defensive air power. Lose the aircraft to standing patrols and exhaustion, and Britain loses regardless of how many sandbags line the beaches. The argument is not settled by vision. It is settled by inertia and one man's stubbornness. Hugh Dowding, already on thin ice with the Air Ministry for his refusal to send more fighters to France, writes directly to the Chiefs of Staff on 16 June. His letter is 2 pages, clinical and unyielding. He does not defend radar as miraculous. He defends it as the only means by which his outnumbered squadrons can be in the right sector of sky at the right altitude when the enemy crosses the coast. Without it, he writes, we revert to the doctrine of 1918, standing patrols, pilot exhaustion, and piecemeal defeat. He closes with a sentence that becomes famous in the small world of air defense planners. Make it work or scrap it, but do not starve it and then blame the system for failing half-built. The cabinet does not give Dowding everything, but it gives him enough. Chain-Home low expansion proceeds slowly. The northern extensions are approved in principle, but delayed for materials. GCI, ground-controlled interception, the next generation radar capable of tracking individual aircraft rather than formations, receives funding for 4 experimental stations, with the rest contingent on results. It is resource triage, not sabotage, but it is close enough to strangulation that engineers at Bodsey and Worth Matravers spend the summer of 1940 improvising with salvaged parts and obsolete valves hoarded from peacetime stocks. The war, it turns out, will be fought with the system they have, not the one they wanted. What they have by July is this: a lattice of 21 chain-home stations along the eastern and southern coasts, each pair of transmitter towers hurling pulses into the North Sea and English Channel on a wavelength long enough to reach 100 miles, but too crude to tell a Dornier from a Heinkel, or 60 aircraft from 90. Range and bearing come through. Altitude is calculated by comparing returns from different towers, a trigonometric guess reliable to within 3,000 feet on a good day. Worse when the weather turns. Anything below 500 feet, Stukas hugging the wave tops, Messerschmitts hedge-hopping to strafe radar stations, remains invisible until the observer corps, men with binoculars in sandbagged posts, telephone it in by eye. The blips, green smears on the cathode tubes at Bodsey, Canewdon, Poling, Ventnor, flow by landline to Bentley Priory's filter room, where junior WAAF officers perform the system's most precarious task, cleaning the data. Multiple stations report the same raid at slightly different bearings. The filterers must reconcile them, assign a single track number, estimate strength and heading, then pass it down to the plotters on the main operations floor. A mistake here, merging two raids into one, splitting one raid into two, sends fighters to empty sky or leaves a corridor undefended. There is no manual for this. The filterers learn by doing, developing an oral grammar of likelihood. Probably one raid, strength 40 plus, vector 270, angels 15, angels thousands of feet, probably. The language of doctrine meeting the improvisation of reality. From the filter room, the cleaned picture flows to group and sector operations rooms where controllers, often former pilots, sometimes academics with no flight experience, vector hurricanes and Spitfires onto intercepts, using grease pencil on perspex, updating second by second as the counters crawl across the map. The orders are typed doctrine. Blue section, Vector 095, climb to Angels 20, enemy 50 miles, strength estimated 20 plus. But the controller's art is improvisation, reading the pilot's fuel state from the time-since scramble, guessing whether the raid will turn or press on, deciding whether to commit the reserve or hold it for the follow-on wave that radar hints at but has not yet confirmed. Ground-controlled interception, when it works, collapses the final gap. GCI stations, smaller, mobile, and shorter range, can see individual contacts within 30 miles and talk a night fighter onto a bomber's tail in darkness or cloud, translating blips into firing solutions like turn starboard 10 degrees, target 2 miles, slightly above, closing. In summer 1940, GCI is experimental, fragile, and trusted by almost no one. The pilots call it boffin magic, half derisive, half hopeful. They want to believe their eyes, not a disembodied voice from a caravan full of valves. But the WAF officers at the plotting tables and the filterers in the dim rooms do not deal in belief. They deal in telephone discipline, in cross-referencing 6 simultaneous reports, in the grinding cognitive load of holding a picture of the sky in their heads, while the scopes flicker and the raid counters multiply, and the voice pipes crackle with requests for updates they barely have time to verify. Oral histories record their experience in fragments. You didn't think about whether it worked. You made it work because there wasn't anyone else. Another from a filterer at Bentley Priory. The pilots got the headlines. We got the blips and the blame when we were wrong. By mid-July, the network is as ready as scarcity and improvisation can make it. Chain home for the first warning, observer core for the details, filter room for the synthesis, sector control for the intercept, and GCI, tentatively, for the kill. It is not elegant, it is not fail-safe, but it is a system, wired and crude, and waiting. And when the Luftwaffe begins its daylight campaign in earnest, it will face not individual squadrons, but an organism that learns, adjusts, and remembers. The question is whether 15 minutes and a grease pencil guess are enough to matter when the bombers come in waves of 300, and the entire defensive margin is 700 tired pilots and the fuel for one more sortie. On 12 August 1940, Hauptmann Horst Liensberger flies his Junkers 88 down the coast at 400 feet, following a compass bearing and the chalk cliffs of Dover, until the target appears. 4 skeletal towers, each taller than a cathedral spire, strung with wire and humming with something his intelligence brief calls coastal direction-finding equipment. The brief is wrong. Ventnor Chainhome is not listening for U-boats. It has been watching Liensberger since he crossed mid-channel. But the Luftwaffe does not yet understand what it is looking at. The towers seem primitive, unmilitary, more like the experimental radio stations that dot the Rhine than anything worth a squadron's attention. Liensberger's bombardier drops his load anyway. 3 bombs walk across the transmitter hall. Glass and valves explode. By noon, Ventnor is off the air, a smoking gap in the grid. Within 6 hours, engineers from the Air Ministry Experimental Station arrive with a van full of spares. By midnight, a jury-rigged transmitter is oscillating on half power, fed by a diesel generator dragged from a nearby searchlight battery. Ventnor limps back online at 0300, radiating just enough pulse to convince German listening posts that nothing has changed. The deception works. Liensberger's unit reports the station destroyed. The Luftwaffe moves on to airfields. This will be the pattern for the next 8 weeks. The Luftwaffe probes, the towers bend, and the invisible seam between hardware and human will refuses to tear. On 15 August, Poling takes a direct hit. Its operations room is relocated to a greenhouse, plotters working under glass panes patched with tape. Dover's aerials are shot through with shrapnel holes that widen in the wind, but still resonate enough to detect formations at 70 miles. Pevensey loses mains power, and the crew runs off batteries and a backup transmitter built from cannibalized training set parts. There is no doctrine for this. Maintenance schedules assume peacetime depots and factory turnaround. Instead, there are corporals with soldering irons, WAAF technicians rewiring receiver racks by torchlight, and station commanders who forge requisition signatures because waiting for approval means staying dark. Berlin strategists notice the attacks achieve little. A post-raid reconnaissance photo of Ventnor taken on 16 August shows the towers still standing, bent, scorched, but erect. And the Luftwaffe concludes that even a successful strike buys only hours of blindness before the British improvise a fix. The cost-benefit calculus tips against radar sites. By late August, the bombers turn to what doctrine has always promised they should destroy: airfields, sector stations, the aircraft, and pilots themselves. This is the moment Dowding has built the system to survive. Because the raids are detected early, Chainhome tracking the buildups over Calais and Le Touquet, passing bearings to the filter room while the formations are still 80 miles out. Fighter Command does not burn pilots in standing patrols. Squadrons scramble on warning, climb on vector, and meet the enemy over the coast or just inland, where a damaged fighter can glide to a home field and a bailed-out pilot can return to duty the next morning. The numbers are merciless anyway. In the 2 weeks after 24th August, Fighter Command loses 103 Hurricanes and Spitfires destroyed on the ground or written off in combat, and 88 pilots killed or too wounded to fly. The sector stations at Manston and Biggin Hill are cratered, their operations rooms shattered, telephone trunks cut. The system begins to fray. And then, because war is accident as much as design, the Luftwaffe makes a choice that saves its enemy. On the night of 24th August, a lost German bomber dumps its load over central London instead of the docks. A navigational error, perhaps, a panicked crew. Churchill orders retaliatory raids on Berlin. Hitler, stung and furious, shifts the weight of the campaign from airfields to cities, from the RAF's infrastructure to its population's will. On 7 September, 300 bombers turn east along the Thames and unload on the East End. The docks burn. The filter room at Bentley Priory tracks the stream as a single, monstrous plot. Raid 5, strength 200 plus. Vector 280, steady at Angels 16. The sector controllers scramble every squadron in 11 Group, but the bombers' target is no longer the squadrons. London ignites. Britain reels. But Fighter Command, bloodied and nearly broken, is granted the one thing it cannot manufacture: time. The cratered airfields are repaired. The severed trunk lines are spliced. Replacement Hurricanes flow from the factories faster than replacement pilots can be trained. But the pilot shortage, which stood 10 days from critical on 5th September, begins barely to stabilize. The Luftwaffe's doctrine, articulated since Douhet and hardened in Spain, insists that terror and fire will crack civilian morale and force capitulation. The doctrine is wrong. London does not surrender. And while the bombers burn houses, the radar towers, ignored again, deemed irrelevant to a city-breaking campaign, continue to pulse, watch, and feed the plot. From inside the system, the experience is seconds, not strategy. Section Officer Eleanor Wadham, a plotter at Uxbridge Sector Station, will describe it in a 1947 oral history with clinical precision. You're moving counters for Raid 14, updating every 30 seconds from filter room, and you hear the controller scramble red section, and you're counting 1, 2, 3. How long until they're at Angels 15? How long until intercept? And the raid splits or merges, and you're calling filter to confirm. And the whole time you know that if you're slow, if you're wrong, someone dies. But you don't know who, and you can't think about it because raid 15 is coming through and your hand is already moving. The geometry is unforgiving. A hurricane takes 12 minutes to scramble and climb to 20,000 feet. A Dornier formation at that altitude, cruising at 180 miles per hour, covers 54 miles in the same 12 minutes. The margin between interception and failure is the distance chain home can see, minus the distance the bomber travels while the fighter climbs, often less than 30 miles, less than 10 minutes, less than the time it takes to miscalibrate one altitude reading or misjudge one heading by 5 degrees. Precision wins inside chaos because the system is not perfect, but it is fast enough and wrong infrequently enough that the exceptions do not collapse the whole. On 15 September, Winston Churchill visits Uxbridge to watch the sector operations room in action. He descends into the bunker at midday, just as the first major raid forms up over Calais. The plotting table is a hive of WAAF officers moving counters, updating tracks. Raid 1, Raid 2, Raid 3. The controller, Park's senior man, speaks into a microphone with the clipped calm of a man narrating surgery, vectoring squadrons onto intercepts he can only see as symbols on a map. Churchill, standing on the observation gallery, watches the squadrons move from available to enemy-sighted to engaged. When the board shows every squadron in 11 group committed and the raids still coming, he leans to Park and asks, "What reserves have we?" Park replies, "There are none." It is the iconic exchange, repeated in every account of the battle. But what Churchill sees, and what crystallizes his understanding, is not heroism abstracted. It is a machine, telephone discipline, plot updates, filter room corrections flowing in a continuous loop, human beings performing trigonometry and probability under pressure, making doctrine work by bending it in real time. The Spitfires matter, the pilots matter, but without the plot, without the 15 minutes of warning and the vectors that put them in the right slice of sky, courage is just fuel burning over empty channel. The Luftwaffe, for its part, is fighting blind. German formations navigate by radio beams, Knickerben, ex-Gerät, precise but rigid, guiding bombers to fixed coordinates with no capacity to adapt when the defenders react. German crews have no ground-controlled intercept, no filtered raid picture, no centralized plot. Each bomber is autonomous, each fighter freelance. Tactical reports from September, now in the Bundesarchiv, describe the British defenses as uncannily responsive, appearing at the correct altitude and position with unnatural regularity. One pilot, writing after his capture, speculates that Britain must have agent networks along the French coast telephoning takeoff times. The possibility that the tall towers he dismisses as Coast Watch antenna doing the seeing does not occur to him until interrogation. Everything you've just heard, the war cabinet tension over radar expansion, the rewiring at Ventnor, the filter room discipline, Churchill's question at Uxbridge, rests on a paper trail you can verify. We are not asking you to trust cinematic narrative over archival fact. We are building the narrative from the archive, and where the archive is silent or contested, we will tell you so. The primary sources are these. The National Archives at Kew hold the War Cabinet conclusions and memoranda under CAB 65, covering weekly decisions from June through September 1940, including the steel and labor allocation debates. Pre-M3 files contain Churchill's office correspondence, including the 8 June memo in which Lindemann frames radar expansion as unproven in sustained operations, and the Prime Minister's marginal note, "Can we afford luxuries?" on a Treasury brief requesting materials for chain home low stations. AIR-16 series covers fighter command operations, including Dowding's 16 June letter to the Chiefs of Staff, "Make it work or scrap it," and sector-by-sector loss reports from August and September. AIR-41 holds the Air Historical Branch narrative, compiled in the late 1940s from war diaries and debriefs. Bawdsey and Ventnor station reports, archived by the RAF Museum and English Heritage, document the 12 August raid, the repair timeline, and the improvised transmitter restart at 0300 on 13 August. Oral histories come from the Imperial War Museum Sound Archive and the Bentley Priory Battle of Britain Trust, including interviews with WAF plotters Eileen Younghusband, Vera Stroud, and Eleanor Wadham, recorded between 1975 and 1991. Their accounts provide the granular detail, counting seconds to intercept, filter room telephone discipline, the grease pencil corrections that operational summaries omit. Secondary scholarship anchors the technical and strategic context. Lewis Brown's A Radar History of World War II remains the standard engineering reference. R.V. Jones's Most Secret War offers the intelligence and scientific rivalry perspective, particularly the Lindemann-Tizard friction. Derek Wood and Derek Dempster's The Narrow Margin reconstructs the day-by-day attrition, cross-referenced with Luftwaffe loss records. Robert Bouderi's The Invention That Changed the World and Alfred Price's Instruments of Darkness detail radar development and German countermeasures. Richard Overy's The Battle of Britain situates the air campaign within industrial and strategic constraints. David Edgerton's Britain's War Machine corrects the resource mythology, showing Britain as improvising under scarcity but not bare-bones poor. English Heritage's Cold War Project and Dobinson's AA command work provide site archaeology, what the towers actually looked like, where the cables ran, what broke and what held. Now, the contested claim. Did Churchill almost cancel radar expansion? The answer is no, if cancel means a formal decision to dismantle chain home. The answer is yes, if we mean resource pressure that nearly strangled expansion at a critical moment. The evidence is allocation memos, not cancellation orders. Pre-M 3323 shows Churchill questioning further expenditure on northern and western extensions in early 1941, arguing that bombers should take priority. CAB 65/13 records a June 1940 debate in which steel for 10 chain-home low stations competes with steel for anti-aircraft guns, with no clear victor until Dowding's intervention tips the balance. Historians differ on how close this came to collapse. Overy reads it as normal wartime triage. Edgerton sees bureaucratic inertia saving radar, despite, not because of, political will. We frame it as pressure and trade-offs, not a singular dramatic near miss, because that is what the file references support. Visual discipline matters as much as textual accuracy. When we show radar, we label it correctly. Chain home for the tall fixed towers operating on 20 to 30 MHz, effective to 120 miles, but altitude ambiguous. Chain home low for the smaller coastal stations covering low-level gaps. GCI for the mobile ground-controlled intercept sets introduced experimentally in late 1940. We do not show the compact 10-centimeter cavity magnetron radars that revolutionized the war in 1941 and after when discussing 1940 RDF. The sets in use during the Battle of Britain were large, crude, and long-wave. Every photograph and schematic will carry a date stamp, so you can see what technology existed when, and every graphic of the radar network will show the coverage gaps, the blind spots below 500 feet, the altitude error bars of plus or minus 3,000 feet that made Angels 15 a rough guess, not a sniper's measurement. We overlay war cabinet minutes and station logs on screen, not as decoration, but as verification. You will see the file reference, the date, the relevant excerpt. If a plotter's oral history provides a quote, we name her and cite the interview year. If a Luftwaffe report survives in translation, we note the archive. If something is inference, a controller's probable decision tree, a filterer's unrecorded thought process, we signal it with language. Likely, suggests, accounts describe. This approach has a cost. It makes the story slower, less mythic, more hedged. But the audience we are speaking to, veterans, skeptics, history readers who have been burned by YouTube gloss, will forgive a careful claim and never forgive a careless one. The towers held, the bombers broke, and the system worked, not because of foresight or genius, but because of steel, telephone wire, tired people, and a command culture that fused hardware to doctrine faster than the enemy could adopt. That claim is defensible. The evidence is in queue, in the interview transcripts, in the station logs and the loss tables, and in the margins of Churchill's memos. We have shown you where to look. Now we can show you what it means. London does not fall. That is the simplest fact, and the one from which everything else flows. By the end of October 1940, the Luftwaffe's daylight campaign has collapsed under losses it cannot afford, fighter attrition above 5% per sortie, bomber crews returning with tales of defenders who appear at the right place and altitude with unnerving regularity, and a strategic objective breaking British morale through terror that proves immune to fire. The night blitz continues into May 1941, grinding and deadly, but it is a campaign of diminishing returns. Without air superiority, invasion is impossible. Without invasion, Britain remains a base, an unsinkable aircraft carrier from which the eventual return to Europe will be mounted. Radar did not win that outcome alone, but without radar, the outcome is unimaginable. The system that survived the summer evolves. By 1943, the towers and plotters of Chain Home are joined by centrometric radars, compact, mobile, precise, using the cavity magnetron that British and American engineers perfect in 1940 but do not deploy at scale until 1941. These are not the crude long-wave sets that watched the channel in September 1940. They are an order of magnitude more accurate, capable of tracking individual aircraft, feeding data to gun-laying computers and night fighters with airborne intercept sets. When the V-1 flying bombs begin their campaign in June 1944, the defense is unrecognizable from 4 years prior. Radar-directed anti-aircraft guns firing proximity-fused shells, coordinated by predictors calculating lead and deflection in real time, arrayed in a gun belt along the southern coast that destroys more than half the missiles before they reach London. The kill rate climbs weekly as the system learns. By August, it exceeds 70%, but the scaffolding, the filter room logic, the telephone discipline, the plotting tables, the doctrine of centralized control married to real-time data is doubtings, built in the years when no one was sure it would matter and nearly starved in the summer when it mattered most. Technology iterates, culture persists. The legacy is not the towers or the scopes, but the grammar of integrated defense, the habit of fusing sensors to shooters through a nervous system that can learn. The lesson, if there is one, that travels beyond 1940 is strategic humility. The systems that save you are rarely the ones that win headlines. Spitfires are photogenic. Pilots make for good copy. Towers and telephone cables and WAAF plotters updating raid tracks every 30 seconds do not. Yet the mathematics are unforgiving. Without early warning, Fighter Command flies standing patrols that exhaust pilots and waste fuel. Without filtering, the controllers drown in false contacts. Without centralized control, courage and aluminum are spent piecemeal, squadron by squadron until nothing remains. The unglamorous work, building the grid, training the filterers, running the cables, trusting the boffins, turns out to be the work that matters when the margin between survival and defeat is 15 minutes and a grease pencil correction. Britain in 1940 is not prescient. It is lucky and stubborn in roughly equal measure. Lucky that Watson Watts's guess in 1935 leads somewhere buildable. Lucky that Dowding holds his post long enough to embed radar into doctrine before the old guard can block it. Lucky that the Luftwaffe misreads the towers, shifts to cities, and grants fighter command the week it needs to recover. But stubborn in the choices that convert luck into structure. The engineers who rewire Ventnor in darkness, the Treasury officials who release just enough steel, the WAAF officers who make the system work by refusing to let it fail. The contrasts we opened with resolved not through victory, but through synthesis. Myth versus reality. The myth says the few won alone. The reality is they won as part of a grid, nodes in a network that amplified individual skill into collective resilience. Doctrine versus improvisation. Pre-war doctrine said bombers would always get through and defense was futile. Improvisation, grease pencil over typed orders, field repairs over depot timelines, proved doctrine wrong and then became the new doctrine, written into post-war air defense manuals from NATO to the Far East. Precision versus chaos. The system was never precise, but it was precise enough. And that sufficiency, sustained under chaos, is its own form of excellence. What we keep missing, across the decades of retellings, is that the story is not about technology winning. It is about people making technology work under conditions that should have broken both. The plotters who held the picture in their heads while the scopes flickered. The sector controllers who committed the last reserve with no guarantee the raid wouldn't split. The engineers who built what they were not quite authorized to build because waiting for permission meant staying blind. The politicians who, barely and grudgingly, released resources to a system they did not fully understand but could not afford to lose. Dowding is sacked in November 1940, forced out by rivals who never forgave his refusal to waste fighters over France. He does not receive his peerage until 1943. Watson Watt is knighted in 1942, after radar is no longer secret and the American press has made him a celebrity. The WAAF plotters are demobilized in 1945. Most never speak of the work until the archives open decades later. The towers stand until the 1950s, then are scrapped for salvage. The system that saved London is dismantled in peace, obsolete before it can be commemorated. But the idea persists that defense is possible if you see early enough, think systematically enough, and trust the people at the unglamorous end of the network to translate noise into signal under pressure. Every integrated air defense system since SAGE, NORAD, Aegis descends from the choice made in a filter room on a September night to believe the blips and vector the fighters and count the seconds to intercept. The question that haunts the legacy is whether Britain would have built it without the pressure of imminent invasion, or whether only desperation forces the leap from useless prototype to indispensable doctrine, and whether once built, the system would have survived had the Luftwaffe understood what it was looking at and targeted not the airfields but the infrastructure, the towers, the trunk lines, the operations rooms that made early warning possible. They came close. Ventnor went dark. Pevensey limped on batteries. One more week of focused raids on the grid and the structure might have cracked, but the week never came. The Luftwaffe turned to London and the towers held.